Alright then, let's talk about Game 3. It's taken until the third game of this series, but the Spurs have finally shown some of that championship pedigree that won them the series against the Thunder. They beat the Knicks 115 to 111, and we're going to go through the ins and outs of how they accomplished that in this video. The main points I want to cover are how the Spurs showed up at MSG, one of the toughest places to play in the entire association, a place that hasn't seen a finals game in 30 years, and dominated. Despite going down 2-0, Wemby and Brunson Classic were both the stars, delivered pretty good games, all things considered, and once again the officiating narrative has reared its ugly head, so I'll be giving my thoughts on that. As I mentioned in the intro, the Spurs have finally shown some of that championship resilience. They only lost the first two games by a combined total of 11 points, which is definitely reflected in how they go. I mean, you think about the Wemby turnover and a few of those missed shots. If things go differently, we could be looking at a 1-1 series, or even, to be honest, a 2-0 series in the other direction. So whilst it hasn't been close, the Spurs have lacked kind of that killer edge that it felt like they had, even in the OKC games where they lost. It just felt like they were playing a bit differently, and we kind of saw that killer edge in the game last night. As I said, like the shaky ball control in the final minutes of Game 2 really gave them away. I mean, that was super easily could have been a tied series, and then the entire framing of the current finals would be very, very different. They didn't let Wemby's missed game winner kind of affect how they walked into, the most famous arena on the planet. Obviously, there's been a lot of kind of controversy around how the tickets are priced for MSG. I mean, I think the lowest get-in price was like $4,500-$5,000, which is absurd, and it prices out a lot of kind of the core fans of the team, because that's an incredibly huge price to pay just to get into a basketball game. So naturally, some of the more hardcore fans are perhaps not going to be there. But even so, MSG is a loud, raucous atmosphere. Even if the arena's a bit louder, just the way going up to it's going to be filled with insane Knicks fans. So to go there, to take care of business and win, even though it was a close game, just to do it at all is very, very impressive. This finals has been a part of a very rare statistic in NBA history. The road team has won all three of the first three games in this series. This is the first time that's happened since the Spurs and Bulls in 1993, and I personally think that's a very good thing. It just goes to show how close it is. I do kind of miss the days in the NBA where home court advantage felt a little bit more real. I mean, certainly, and this is a testament to the Knicks fans more than anything, but certainly in those two Spurs games, it almost felt like a 50-50 crowd split, which is very, very impressive. But again, that might just tie back into the fact that it was cheaper for Knicks fans to go to those games 1 and 2 in San Antonio than it was for them to go to MSG last night, which is absolutely ridiculous. But it does show how close this finals is. So as I say, first time in over 30 years that's the case. And I just think it's good. I think it's important for the league to have that. However, I do miss having the kind of home atmosphere being a bit more important. As has been mentioned around kind of the league media so many times, this is the first finals game in MSG since 1999, and the Spurs actually looked more composed in crunch time than the Knicks did. You don't want to say it's complacency, but when you take the first two games on the road in the finals, certainly even from Spurs fans, there was a big feeling that they'd already won the series, and that might have potentially, you don't want to guess too much, but that might have seeped into the Knicks locker room a little bit, because, if you win those first few games in San Antonio, and then you come back to what they know is a very big, very raucous arena, they might have been thinking, okay, well, this series is done and dusted. However, the Spurs come out with kind of a nothing left to lose attitude, and just, we're going to go out, we're going to put everything we can on the floor and try and breathe some life back into this series for San Antonio. So that could have potentially have played a part. Kind of something that backs up the idea that the Spurs were a bit more composed is after trailing by as many as 11 in the second quarter, the Spurs responded with a huge third quarter swing, outscoring the Knicks 35-27 in that quarter, kind of getting themselves back in the game and obviously eventually winning it. Another thing that I really want to mention is obviously a lot of the talk has been Wemby and Brunson, and in the last video, I believe a reaction to Game 2, I kind of mentioned how it was almost more like Karl Towns had been the better player in this series so far, but in this game, the two stars did show out. Wemby and Brunson both had 32 points. it just happened that Wemby got a little bit more help from his supporting cast. Wemby's final stat line: 32 points on 61%, 11 of 18 shooting, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, 3 blocks, and 2 steals. Absolute domination on both ends. Almost what we've come to expect from Wemby, but it's the first time he's really had a game like that in the finals. Really kind of showcasing his ability as a leader of the team. I'm a huge Victor Wembanyama guy, as it seems like everyone is. Although I have noticed now that Wemby's coming up against one of the bigger markets in the league, and everyone hates OKC, right? That's nothing new. So when you're playing OKC, you're automatically the darlings of the entire association. Everyone's going to love you. However, now that we're in the finals, they're playing New York, which is the biggest or second biggest market in the entire league, depending on how you look at the Los Angeles Lakers. I've seen so much more Wemby hate online. It's actually unreal, and people are going to make whatever excuse they want. They're going to say, he's getting more help from the league. He's getting more help from the refs. The refs pander to him, whatever. You're going to see all the racist kind of guys being like, oh, he's French, whatever. Which, I'm not making that up. I have seen that several times while scrolling through basketball media today. And now that it's just because he's now facing the New York Knicks. And I'm not taking a shot at Knicks fans. They've got every right. He's the opposition. You should hate him, absolutely. But it's just all those neutral people that were ganging up on OKC, and really supporting Wemby. And then as soon as it flips, now they hate Wemby. It just seems a bit ridiculous to me. But getting back on track, Jalen Brunson also got 32 points, but it was a little bit worse efficiency. It kind of felt like he was having to search for and, really push for his points more, not necessarily to the detriment of his team, but it certainly didn't look like the game came as smoothly and as easily to him as it did for Wembanyama last night. He went 11 for 25, 44% shooting with 5 boards and 5 assists. As I say, he had to work much, much harder for his points, and he didn't do as much on the defensive end as Wemby did, which obviously, no surprise there, but it did feel like there was a noticeable difference. Jalen Brunson's never been a particularly excellent defender, due in part to his size and his frame, kind of holding him back on that end of the ball, and you can't necessarily really blame him too much. But it just kind of felt like there was a very noticeable, very large discrepancy there. Brunson was often forced into much more difficult isolation possessions as well, kind of more similar to Wemby in Game 2, to be fair, where it's just kind of like give him the ball, he's your star player, let him create something on the ball. And the Spurs were happy to let Brunson score, which he did do. 32 points is an excellent game. But that would take away New York's ball movement, force Cat out of the offense, and kind of put the onus completely on Jalen Brunson. And whilst he did have a good game, it wasn't good enough to win it by himself. So I think he definitely played into the Spurs game plan to a certain extent. And a good game plan, you can't do much about that. The help I mentioned earlier that Victor Wembanyama got that Jalen Brunson didn't necessarily get came largely in part of the form of Stephon Castle, as he kind of arrived on the final stage for the first time, scoring 23 points, crucially taking a lot of pressure off of Wembanyama, meaning the Knicks couldn't solely focus on him on the defensive end. Opens up the floor for the whole team, and he especially looked very good, very secure on the MSG floor, not letting the guard and really take him over. And it has to be mentioned, obviously, this playoffs, the refs have been largely criticised. It's been one of the major talking points for everyone in the entire league. Most notably in that Spurs OKC series, as I mentioned. But in this game, the prevailing opinion is that the Spurs were actually the team being favoured. There is potentially some kind of merit to this discussion. I mean, there was a bit of a free throw disparity. The Spurs went 25 for 32, shooting 78% from the free throw line. The Knicks 18 of 22, shooting 81%. So the Spurs did get more on the free throw end, but I feel like, and I've seen Knicks fans talk about this as well, a lot of that came from, I think Wemby was just a lot more aggressive. He drove to the basket a lot more than we've seen earlier on in this series. He was forcing the issue more. He wasn't taking as many, tough mid-range jump shots, not taking as many pull-up threes. He was driving to the basket, drawing contact, getting free throws. So whilst there was definitely a free throw discrepancy, I think it was part due to maybe a few box scores that I saw, but honestly, more than not, it was just because this is the first time this series where we've seen Wemby and the Spurs team as a whole just say, right, fuck it, we're going to drive to the basket, and we're going to, really initiate contact and kind of make us the problem, as opposed to settling for what the New York Knicks defense wants us to settle for. Obviously, there is a point where the NBA does probably want a longer series. They don't want a sweep. They don't want a short series where it feels kind of over before it's even began. But I do think that is perhaps overplayed a little bit. At the end of the day, the Knicks just made their shots. They were more efficient. They took better opportunities. They gave their star player more help. And while the refs can obviously influence a game, I don't think they can't put the ball in the basket for these players. You know what I mean? So I do think that perhaps the NBA wanting a longer series, whilst there might be some merit to it, I do think it's overblown in the NBA fandom as a whole. At the end of the day, the Spurs just made their shots. Kind of a stat that backs this up is it was 21-7 in favour of the Spurs actually when it comes to points off of turnovers, which does both prove that the Spurs were just playing good defence, playing better overall in the game today, but also breaks the trend that the Spurs have had over these playoffs, that turnovers their biggest weakness, and that's how they're going to lose all the games. Turnovers definitely impacted the first 2 games of this series, but in this third one, the Spurs were controlling the ball a lot better, forcing the issue on the other end, and making New York turn the ball over. And I think that definitely kind of had an impact and played a part in this one. That's all we've got time for today. I will see you obviously for the next game recap, but also we're going to be covering some baseball very, very soon. So goodbye.